All right. Very good. Okay, so hybrid threats. One of the interesting things is that the EU and NATO never really agreed on a common definition, and I think that's to their credit because they didn't want to sort of waste time working on a definition. I know some people prefer definitions, but this is my working version. Is this, and mainly it boils down to how do you achieve aggressive political aims on the cheap? Look, war is expensive. It causes a lot of problems. It's difficult for both sides. So how do you achieve political aims at the lowest possible price? And that's really what hybrid threats are doing. I talk about them as hybrid threats and not hybrid warfare for a reason. Because if we militarize it, and I know everyone in military uniform, of course, you're going to see it that way. But what I've found is when we think of it and we talk about it as hybrid warfare, what a government will do is give it to the MOD, and the other ministries can sort of say, okay, the MOD has it. When the MOD doesn't always have all of the authorities to deal with it. And I'll talk a little more about that later. So I like to frame it as hybrid threats, and I know it, the hybrid COE in Helsinki, that's how we would frame it as well. It's a threat to both public and private entities. One thing a lot of people aren't always aware of is that the private sector is usually the first target. So, the media, logistics systems, telephone companies, all these sorts of things are found in the private energy. These are all things controlled by the private sector. So a number of challenges for governments to sort of detect and respond to these things. And of course, it is a threat to public safety and security in the stricken nation, obviously. So let's go to the next slide. We don't want to sort of linger too long there, but there's always 1 or 10 or 11 people in any crowd. Can we go to our next slide, please? There's always a few people in every crowd who will sort of say, well, Chris, this has been around forever. This is nothing new. And to some degree, that's true. Could we please click to our next slide? Okay, so what makes them different? What makes it different today is that we're a globalized world. So a lot of these same instruments of statecraft were available 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 300 years ago, but they weren't as instant. We didn't have this instant communication. We didn't have these global systems of finance and commerce. I can pick up my phone here and I can order a pizza in Singapore and have it delivered to someone I don't even know, right? I can do that now through globalization, but that also means that someone in Mongolia can call me and tell me something or send a message to me. So this globalized world is what makes a difference. And I always think about hybrid threats as really the weaponization of globalization. We'll get into a little more about what that means. So let's please go to the next slide. And I'm going to talk about how I like to see it. I look at resilience. I look at hybrid threats as a threat to governance. So let's get our first click on here. So forgive me, this one builds. So everything that constitutes governance, the sovereign territory, trust of the people, our rule of law, financial system, that list could go on and on. The slide's not big enough. You would get bored. It wouldn't work. But you get the idea. If you think about war if we talk about war in the classic sense, if you're attacking another side, you're seeking to govern their space. If you're attacking into some territory, you want to govern their space. When you're defending, you want to maintain governance of your space. So, we're seeing the very same thing here with hybrid threats. It's an attack on our ability to govern ourselves. And it's even an attack on a private company's ability to govern its electrical network, its communications networks, everything. So I tend to look at it in terms of governance. Okay, so what does that mean? What does that mean when we talk about governance? So let's click one more, please. So hybrid threats is seeking to, hybrid threats are not, people don't commit hybrid threats just for fun, but rather to achieve a political objective. So they want to weaken governance. Maybe they want to weaken governance to soften up a target to make them easier to take down politically, soften the target to make them less organized, to soften them for a conventional attack, create chaos to take another nation or state and sort of make them be so occupied they can't interfere somewhere else. There's a lot of reasons, but this is, the main, when you frame it in terms of governance, it's to achieve a political objective, weakening governance, right? Let's get one more click, please. But there's a few things that are often related when we talk about governance, right? Transnational threats, organized crime, all these sorts of things, they're seeking to weaken governance, but for another purpose. So organized crime groups, they're attacking governance, but only a little piece of it so that they can cut a little hole for themselves through the governing structure so they can act with impunity, so they can move drugs, guns, money, whatever. They don't care about the rest of governance. They just want that little piece that's in their way so they can move in and out. Now, there are situations sort of like Colombia in the 80s where a transnational threat can sort of take over a lot of the governance, but that's an extreme case. But this is where there's a similarity. They're both an attack on governance, but for different purposes and different levels of influence, depending on the size of the threat. So what do we have in place? How do we protect governance? What are all the elements that allow us to build resilience? So let's click one more, please. This is where you have all of the different elements of governance, our military or defense, the trust and cohesion between the people and the government, law enforcement, financial systems, health systems, the public-private accountability and public-private relationship, which is very important, which we always see in hybrid threats. The places where you have really good relationships there tend to do better. Civil society, all of the above. I'm going to click one more. And we put all these things together. When they work well together, we call that resilience. Okay, that's kind of where when we talk about building resilience, we're talking about building coherence and competence and all of these things together to protect governance, right? But there's one other thing when we talk about resilience that's also related. It's not a hybrid threat, but it's in the neighborhood as a threat to governance. So let's click one more time, because I think it's important when you can see how these come together. So a natural disaster creates a great challenge for the full spectrum of governance. So you just look at these three things on the right. Hybrid threats, that's what we're talking about today. But what else is a threat to governance? What else impacts governance? And what else are we building resilience to deal with? And that's, I always look at it in terms of these three things. Okay, so we can talk more about that later, but this is so you get an idea where my mind is when I frame these things. So let's go to our next slide, please. We always come to a discussion of how to deter hybrid threats, and it's not so easy because most theories of deterrence are based on the use or threat of military force, or the show of force. We're going to exercise somewhere, do all kinds of things. And that we can't always do that when it comes to hybrid threats, right? We don't always want to escalate a situation by accident, or we don't want to be tricked into escalating a situation because that might be what the hybrid actor wants. So again, if you think about, they're trying to achieve political objectives on the cheap. So how do you deter that? Is you raise the price. If you can harden the target, if you can make a very resilient society that's difficult to attack their governance, or it's difficult to weaken them, if you can quickly attribute and respond decisively, that's another form of deterrence. So a lot of the deterrence that comes in hybrid threats is in our ability to have a fast, accurate, and coherent response. Very difficult to achieve for a number of reasons. So let's go to our next slide, please. So before we get too far, there's also just a few ways to look at hybrid threats in general. There's 4 basic steps to countering hybrid threats. The first one is you have to detect it. You have to know something's happening. When it comes to certain kinds of cyber attacks or certain kinds of infiltrations, you don't know it's happened until 0 day, until something's happening. And so it's sort of like the human body. The human heart has no nerve endings on it until someone has a heart attack, right? We always say, oh, he was a picture of health and he had a heart attack. Well, not really, because there was something wrong there. But we don't always have the ability, think about the human body, to detect those things. And what governments have been doing the last 5 to 7 years is looking, do they have nerve endings to detect in all the places they need it in their society if there's a problem, if there's a potential hostile state action happening. So that's the first one. First, you have to detect it, right? And sometimes it's easy to detect. Sometimes it's not. At least if the power goes out, you have a power outage. That's not very hard, right? Attribution. This one is often talked about. I've done a lot of work on attribution, and this is basically, there's 2 pieces to attribution. The first one is at the expert level, determining what happened. Was it an accident? Was it system failure? Was it an angry employee who didn't get a raise and decided to throw a wrench in the works? Or was it an actual hostile state action? We don't always know that. Very important to determine. You don't want to sort of escalate militarily or politically with another country when it's, Ralph decided he was angry, he didn't get a raise, right? You really want to, or there was an accident or a fire. But attribution, there's an expert level, what happened, who caused it, or what caused it. And then there's let's say you determine it was a hostile state, adversarial action. That's the expert level attribution gives you that, right? Then there's the political decision about what to do about it. Do you respond in some way? Do you may have a press conference and announce, we know this other country did it? That's the other aspect of attribution. And that delta between the two is very difficult because the experts are under a great deal of pressure by the politicians to come up with answers. And oftentimes they don't have the full answer. Anyone who's worked in the intelligence world and analysis, you know what this very well. So this is a constant pressure, and we can talk a little more about that later. The next one is respond. Response covers a lot of things. You can, respond publicly saying, we know they did it. You can lock down your borders. You can enact certain different kinds of measures with your cybersecurity. There's so many ways to respond. And of course, there's, you can launch bombers at the other guy. There's a whole spectrum of response, but response is one. The next one is recover, and this is sort of stop the bleeding. And the reason these are not sequential is you don't want to wait until you have all the attribution finished before you recover. If the power goes down, you bring it back up. If disinformation is out there, you're responding to it, right? That's why they're non-sequential. And you're going to see later in each of these stages where CIMIC can come in. So let's go to our next slide, please. So some of the key challenges that we deal with here. One is disinformation. It's difficult. The response dilemma is, do you respond fast and possibly not respond correctly? Or if you respond too slow because you want to get it 100% right, if you're too late, once that lie is out there or that disinformation is moving around your society, it's very difficult to pull back. So the response dilemma is a huge challenge for governments. Attribution, which I just explained, those two levels and that pressure from the politicians on the experts, give me an answer, give me an answer. And sometimes these things take time, right? Consensus is very difficult, not only within multinational organizations like NATO, like the EU, to get governments to agree on a response, but inside of our own governments, for all the different ministries, you have a prime minister sitting at one end of the table and all the ministries who have different ideas of what happened and coming up with a common situational awareness and common analysis inside of the same government is not always easy. This is one of the key challenges. The other one is the public and private relationships. That's always a challenge for us because the first targets are often the private sector. Private sector doesn't always tell government once something's happened, right? They will kind of quietly fix it because they don't want to get sued by someone because of liability. There's a lot of reasons for that, and we can talk about that in the Q&A if you like, but that's one of the big challenges we face. So let's go to our next slide, and now we're going to start to get into sort of where you all might find yourselves. And the big challenge that military people face when dealing with hybrid threats is solving the authorities and capability gaps. So the non-MOD ministries, they often have the authority to act. The telecommunications ministry, the interior ministry, the transportation ministry, they have all these authorities, but they don't always have the capabilities they need in a crisis. The MOD, we have so many capabilities, right? We have all kinds of capabilities, some of which can be used in a hybrid crisis, but we don't have the authorities to do that, in particular inside of our own countries, right? In democratic countries, we have a lot of laws that prevent us from doing certain things. However, with the right national and legal policy frameworks, we can figure out how the military can provide support to other ministries to respond to hybrid threats and, disasters, all kinds of things, right? So one of the ways we do this, one of the ways we work on this is we look at, and this is what I do a lot of the last several years, is we run tabletop exercises. First, we run it with the government and we want to identify gaps and vulnerabilities in the legal and policy frameworks. The last thing you want is, a lot of times at that level, it looks like a volleyball game. Either three ministries are going for the ball or no one does because they think the others have it and the ball hits the ground. This is what we don't want to have happen. But you can run these tabletop exercises at any level to identify vulnerabilities in the legal frameworks. You go back to your parliament and change laws. You could test cooperative mechanisms to see how well they work, how well we understand each other. The reason we do all this is because no government can pay for the same capabilities twice. Why should the transportation ministry have to go to parliament and ask for billions of euros for something that the MOD already has and can provide? So that's the basic idea there. So one more slide, please. Next. Okay, so what are we trying to do here? We want to build resilient, credible, and capable governance. We've got to be coherent together. We need deeper cooperation among the public, private sector, and international organizations. Obviously, high trust societies, it works better for dealing with hybrid threats and disinformation campaigns, although what we've seen the last few years is a lot of high trust societies are becoming not so high trust societies because of all the disinformation out there. And there's three basic approaches for doing this that I'll go off in order. The first is whole of government approach. So let's go to the next three slides, which cover these things. Next slide, please. So whole of government, you hear people talk about it. That doesn't mean the whole government's involved. It means the whole government's invited. Different ministries and agencies from local level, federal level, throughout the government. And what's valuable about this, we don't do this because it's cute and fun and sing kumbaya, but we do these things because they give us something. So in this case, this enables us to take authorities and capabilities at various levels, bring them together to put on the problem. This is where we talk about supported and supporting relationships, and the MOD is very seldom ever in the lead. We are leading from behind. We are the supporting ones, right? We know this, right? So let's go to our next slide, and that is the whole of society approach. Whole of society is just like whole of government, but you also include the private sector, civil society, and academia. What does this give us that whole of government didn't? Once we get the private sector or civil society, we get all kinds of new capabilities and information sources, all kinds of new abilities to deal with the problem. But it also helps us to build support among the population, right? This is another big one. And the big thing of the whole society is that people support what they help create. So if you want the private sector to be part of the solution, they need to be part of the whole process, right? And this is why I do a lot of the exercises with governments and private sector so they can work together and figure out ways to communicate, share information, and whatnot. But that's whole of society. That's what we're talking about. Now, again, that doesn't mean everyone's going to join. There's parts of society that say, I don't think so, not interested. Good luck to you. Yeah, good luck to you all, not us, right? It's not on everybody. It's on everyone's invited if we if we can fit them and if there's a use for that. And now let's go to the next one. Slide, please. And this is where we come to the comprehensive approach. Now, this is, I think my dear friend Joachim Haupt is out there somewhere. He and I and a few others teach the comprehensive approach seminar for the NATO headquarters every year. So happy to cover this piece of it. But the comprehensive approach is basically a international whole of society. And what we're doing here in this case is taking all the different actors internationally, internally, local, national, private sector, civil society, and working together with a shared sense of responsibility and openness. So the part that's very interesting about the comprehensive approach is that it is not hierarchical. No one is in charge. It is a collaborative effort among equals at each step of the way. Sometimes we'll have a group like the ICRC will come and join us for a comprehensive approach, and they'll be around for the first part and they'll say, okay, thanks, I'm done. That's it for me. The World Bank might come around, sniff around and say, that's great, but let me know when you get to the the 20 to 30 year plan. Then I'll be involved because this is too immediate for me, right? And there's a whole separate briefing on that we could do another time. But that's basically what the comprehensive approach is, right? Often misunderstood, but that's the essence of it. So let's go to our next slide. We're getting into where you can really get involved. A few key lessons from dealing with hybrid threats over the years. One is you can't surge a relationship. So you all know this as CIMIC people, building trust relationships. Those things you do so well, keep doing them. Those are important. Those capabilities you bring to build relationships is a big thing you bring to this problem set. Attribution is the sovereign decision of the host nation that has been struck. So the stricken nation is the one who leads. Outsiders, NATO coming in somewhere, the EU, someone else, we can't tell them. We can offer them information, but it's that government that decides everything on attribution. It's their decision, no one else's. That's an important one to understand, because I've had people say, well, can't we just kind of tell them what? It's like, no, good luck with that. It doesn't work. Once a crisis begins, whatever resiliency you built, that's what you've got. It's sort of like a football match. If you're going to the World Cup final, however healthy your side is, and however ready they are, and however well they play together, that's what you got. That's it. Same thing here with resilience. We're building resilience now in time for when crisis happens. Once a crisis happens, all you can do is change your resilience posture but whatever you built, that's what you've got. And that's a big thing to explain to politicians. They think some politicians I've had to explain to, they think once the crisis starts, now we can build resilience. It's like waiting until it's raining to build the house. It's a little late for that. No government can pay for the same capabilities twice. We know that. Supported and supporting relationships. I think as CIMIC people, you inherently understand that. It doesn't really need to explain to you. But now let's go to my second to last slide, which is where you're like, Chris, what does this mean for us? What can CIMIC do? Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay. What can CIMIC do? So your big role here is you play a key role in military support to civilian authorities. That ability to be the interface, to translate to each other what things mean, to build those trust relationships. That is a huge role for CIMIC across the board when it comes to dealing with hybrid threats. You play a key role in building resilience and bringing capabilities, training, sometimes military engineers to build things or dig things out. There's so many different aspects that CIMIC can bring to it. Assisting with detection and attribution. When you're in a situation, the information sources that you develop as CIMIC and your ability to move those quickly to host governments, to your higher headquarters is extremely important. Again, this is something you already do, receiving and moving information. But in particular here, that will really be helpful with detection and attribution. Now, you won't make the attribution, but the information you pass as a CIMIC team could be decisive. We don't know. Assisting with response and recovery, you know this because this is what we deal with in natural disasters and similar things. This is stuff you know how to do. And finally, assisting with strategic messaging. You're out there interfacing with people, interfacing with the locals, interfacing with the private sector in these situations. You have a great ability to pass the strategic messaging down from your higher headquarters, from your multinational core, from NATO headquarters, from your national government in Warsaw or Berlin or wherever it is. Very hugely important that you can do that. So a lot of these things are things you already know how to do, things you already do well. All right. And I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A, but I think I'm trying to stay on time. So it's been a real pleasure to bring this all of you to you here. Let's go to one last slide. And my final one, and that is, you're going to run into a lot of things in dealing with hybrid threats and, seeing things you can do, but you don't have the authority to do. And I would just remind you, this is a basketball coach that I always like this quote because it always seems to apply to these things. And that is, don't let what you cannot do interfere with what you can do. And don't let it interfere with what you can do together to make these problems smaller and to really bring the effectiveness and let people see what CIMIC can really do. Thank you so much for your attention. It's been a real pleasure.